Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Now, in this channel, I already have like 24 hours of video content, and I really hope that this video would be at least shorter than maybe 90 minutes, hopefully. And by the way, I already have like more than 100 aphorisms on my page on Facebook, Eugene the Philosopher. I'll probably put a link in the description if you're interested. Okay, so let us talk about history in this video. So more or less I'm going to continue this line of reasoning that I've started with my video, The Nature of Knowledge, where I said that any kind of knowledge is really just a bunch of stories that we tell each other about the world. Then I've continued this line with my stories of medicine, where I've tried to deconstruct the basic narratives of medicine, or rather basic cultural patterns that stand behind these narratives. So here I wish to do the same thing with history, and of course ramble about various stuff in the process. So we'll consider historical knowledge, and I would claim that the basic template for any sort of story of history is such. So we've had a state X, so everything was in this state, so to speak. Then we've had a historical event, and then everything was in the state Y after the historical event, right? So this is the most basic skeleton of any sort of historical history, or rather historical story. So, and I've talked about something like that in my video about repentive thinking. So a lot of things that I've said there would be applicable here too. And you might notice that it pretty much resembles the plot of a drama. In particular, well, to make it even more resembling of the plot of the drama, I would say we need to add two more elements actually to this basic scheme. In particular, I would say that it's now 5-element scheme. That would be much better to understand how history, the stories of history work. So we have pre-state X, which is followed by state X, which is followed by historical event, which is followed by state Y, which is followed by post-state Y. It's kind of a not the best terminology probably, but hopefully it would do what it should do. So and you can notice how resembling it is of the basic dramatic, let's say, elements of plot, where we have more or less, well, they have different names and different classifications, but it's more or less 5-element scheme. We have like a prologue, this pre-state X, as I've called it. Then we have a setup, the state X. Then we have a climax, which is the historical event. Then we have the outcome, which is state Y. And then we have the epilogue, which is what I've called post-state Y, yeah. So it's, for example, Freytag, the so-called Freytag's pyramid has also those 5 elements, although they're called differently, but nevertheless, the point is pretty much the same. So I would claim that, yeah, the stories of history are built somewhat similar to this simple scheme, pretty much always. So let's examine some of the elements and talk a little bit about what's going on in general. So this pre-state X, this prologue, so to speak, I would say that it represents the larger story, all right, or like a background or context in which our current story, this simple X to Y, is embedded in, right? And whereas the post-state Y, this epilogue, is like the general conclusions, the impact of this simple story X to Y, well, on the larger narratives, larger stories, right? And whereas the simple story itself, X to Y transition through the historical event, is fully deterministic, and it's kind of isolated. So in some sense you might say that this pre-state X and post-state Y are the points where this localized X to Y transition connects to the larger story larger both in terms of size and time scale, right? So something like that. And like finding this internal logic of transition from X to Y, given this external context, is more or less what historian does usually, right? But we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'll make a couple of comments about like historical practice in particular. So yeah, and I think in my video about bad ending, I've talked about that a little bit, like about this internal logic of the process, right? We talked about drama and how like a playwright is almost like an engineer who needs to find like shortest paths given these certain boundary conditions, right? So this pre-state X and post-state Y set those boundary conditions, and we need to solve, roughly speaking, this differential equation in between them or something like that to find the trajectory inside this isolated box, which represents the transition from state X to state Y through the historical event. So that's more or less what's going on. Hopefully it's more or less clear what I've said. Now, you might ask a question, well, what about free will? Because, well, I've said that the transition from X to Y is deterministic, but in history we're often dealing with people, and I would actually say that always we're dealing with people. So how do we deal with the issue of free will if everything is deterministic? Well, I would say that it is a justifiable question, but at the same time, I would say that we ignore free will in history pretty much. And the way we do that is, in particular, we just insert all the unknowns, let's say, in this pre-state X. So in the prologue, we already preset, I mean, when we're dealing with a story of history, historical story, if you like, we preset all the unknowns, all the free will-ish type of things in this pre-state X, right? We just introduce them like those black boxes that Bruno Latour keeps talking about. And then we just, whenever the signal from them affects the story, the transition from X to Y, we just take it for granted. Like, it was already there, you know, it was just waiting its time to impact the story, but there's no free will still. We just kind of count it already. We've counted it, you know, this particular input. And well, I can give you an example if you like. Like, for example, we might have a story that would, like just a very simple example, like John was vindictive and Richard treated him badly. So later when Richard came to John for help, John refused. So everything I told before, so not this so, but the previous one. So John was vindictive and Richard treated him badly previously. So this is the pre-state X, right? It's all the mechanics of what's gonna happen later is already set. It's already like solid. We cannot do anything to it, right? So, and the story X to Y is about Richard coming to John asking for help and John refusing. And here this pre-state kind of makes this input that, like, okay, John is vindictive and Richard was behaving bad towards him previously. So that makes the transition understandable. Like, John didn't help Richard because of this preset conditions, right? So more or less that's how we deal with free will in historical narratives. I would say that it should be pretty clear, hopefully at least. Okay, and it doesn't really matter when those black boxes of free will are going to open up. Really doesn't matter. And again, to reinforce my analogy with drama, there's a famous sort of like metaphor or like a figure of speech which is called Chekhov's rifle. You know, the Anton Chekhov, the Russian playwright and just writer, novelist, So he had this saying that, well, if you have a rifle in your play hanging on the wall, at some point it should shoot, you know, it should, how do you say it, discharge, whatever. So, well, his point was kind of like, you shouldn't put in your story anything that is irrelevant, you know, everything should be somehow, everything should act, everything that you introduce should have its role at a certain moment, right? But at the same time, my point here is that all of those rifles that we shoot later, we kind of put them already at the very beginning. We kind of introduce them, expose them to the public when we're talking about history, I mean. So, and that kind of eliminates the problem of free will, at least supposedly, at least that's how it works, usually. Okay, so, okay, so the next element we should consider is the climax, which is the historical event itself. And here, I'll talk about this a little bit later near the end, but here I'll just note that the time frame that we should choose for our narrative, for our uncovering of the story should fit the climax pretty much, because, well, it might be, I mean, the time frame might be short when we're talking about like an assassination or something like that, or just murder. I mean, like assassination of Kennedy or whatever, Alexander II, the Russian Tsar. Or it might be the long time frame if we're dealing with, let's say, a story of a formation of a certain societal class, then we'll definitely need a longer time frame, like at least decades, if not centuries, right? Then, yeah, so we need the proper scale. And the scale should be tied to actors, to those subjects or objects we're dealing with in this particular case. And anyway, the climax seems to be the center of any story, not only the story of history, but any story really. But in terms of history, the climax represents, and again, drama also, the climax represents this axis around which the state of things kind of turns from this state X to the state Y. So the climax, this historical event, kind of, you know, it's kind of like a lever, something like that. Okay, so yeah. But you might ask a question, well, which forces do like produce this turn of events, of the state of things? And I would say that the primary force that we should consider here is again the same as in drama, and that is conflict. And the conflict might be explicit or implicit, for example. Like, well, a pretty typical picture of, let's say, 19th century literature is when you have a larger conflict, again, in this representative, perhaps, in some sense, in these pre-state X and post-state Y, but anyway, it's some larger narrative where some conflict persists, and the characters of this particular piece are only like manifestations or like avatars of this larger conflict. So each one of them represents something, like something bigger, like again, societal class, or like particular generation, or gender, or whatever, like something like that, right? So that would be implicit conflict. So through the relationships of these characters, we kind of get a picture of the society as a whole with all of these contradictions and things like that. So it was a pretty powerful instrument for literature in this regard, and drama also, obviously. Okay. Okay, so, but what if we don't have any conflict? And as I've said again, it's not necessarily this thing. It's not necessarily we have implicit conflict. We might just have an explicit conflict where it's, let's say, some familial affairs between the characters in the play, right? So, but anyway, what if we don't have conflict in the first place? Well, I would say that in this case, there's no point in telling this story. Like, again, there's no energy to turn the events from the state X to state Y, and it's just not interesting. We cannot relate to it. We cannot even see what's going on, right? It's pointless. It's just some bunch of people doing something without any meaning. Without conflict. Essentially, I would say that the conflict is like the energy supply, or the tension, or you might say the driver, or the primum mobile, this Latin phrase, which again draws from the analogy of science, like mechanics, with theater and history in this particular case, where if you have deterministic laws like Newtonian mechanics or whatever, then you still have a question, well, how it all began, at least in religious narratives where like God created the world, etc. So it was a pretty popular idea back then that God was exactly this primum mobile, like the first reason, right? So the God created world and kind of pushed it into motion, so that's this primal reason, so to speak. And then the world just enveloped itself deterministically, right? So it's the same picture here. As I've said, we have X to Y transition, which is deterministic, but we still need a conflict, kind of preset this primum mobile, like Deus ex machina or whatever, although that's not really applicable to this case, but this sort of internal energy that drives this machine, The machine is deterministic, but it needs fuel, and that is conflict. So more or less something like that. And it makes the story tangible, visible, fit for retelling, and objective, you might say, because, well, again, watch my video, Nature of Knowledge. There I propose my own definition of objectivity somewhere at the very end, which is, I call an objective story any story that can be told. And it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, it's the higher level of analysis already. Okay, and you might say it's natural to think in those terms, in terms of conflict, again, returning to Nietzschean ideas, because, well, if the world is will to power, and like the struggle between different wills to power, then you can only perceive it, you can only understand it in terms of wills to power that compete. And if you don't see any wills to power that compete, the story is pointless. You cannot even like objectify it. You cannot condense it into something meaningful. You need that narrative, that guy wants one thing, that girl wants other thing, that third guy wants some other thing completely. So you have this conflict of wills to power, right? So that's perhaps one other indication that this Nietzschean approach is very deep and very ontologically reasonable, let's say. Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples of explicit and implicit conflict. So explicit conflict would sound something like the story with explicit conflict, would sound like maybe like Battle of Yoba River in 1488 was key in struggle between Sepulcharian Kingdom and Proleptic Republic for influence in the region. Whereas implicit conflict might sound like passing a law on merchant liberties by Kaiser von Fels zum Meer in 1337 did strengthen the position of emerging bourgeoisie and weaken the landed aristocracy, for example. So, yeah, hopefully you kind of felt the whatever I was talking about before. And so again, I should repeat that if there is no conflict, there's no point in telling a story. It's not interesting. It's not relevant. We cannot relate to it. The historical event disappears, right? And without the conflict, the same two stories might sound like two groups of people were fighting near the river, or how I think the British say, having a bit of extracurricular or something like that. Or in the case of the second story that I told you, might be something like a well-dressed dude wrote something on a piece of vellum. So these both are definitely stories. I mean, they have all the properties of stories, again, which I've listed in my video, Nature of Knowledge, but they are not historical. I mean, they have no point. There's no point in telling you that. You don't understand what's important, what's not important, what's going on in the first place, etc. So you lack all these elements, important elements, the context, the importance, etc. So hopefully that's more or less clear. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is the political aspect, because, well, again, my definition of politics in a broad sense is that it's the decision-making in the situation of conflict of interests, which is, again, it contains the word conflict, right? So, and again, by speaking about political aspect, I'm really speaking about in a broad sense. So the same aspect is in economics, religion, culture, science, anything. So it's not politics proper, right? Although politics proper is also the same thing, pretty much. Yeah, so mark that. There's a political aspect. We'll return to that a little bit later. So at the same time, you might say, well, this approach is not new. I mean, speaking about conflict as the driver of history, I mean, Hegelianism also pretty much is based on the same idea, like history as solving of contradictions, or like fight of opposites, you know, something like that. And again, Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, have had the same idea. But in this case, what I'm talking about is a little bit different still, because I'm not giving these contradictions and whatever subjects are involved in these contradictions any ontological status. I'm not saying that's how the world is. What I'm saying is that those contradictions, the conflict, etc., are only the attributes of the story, right? So they have no being outside the story. They're only valid in this framework of the story, even if it's the story of history that we're telling each other, right? So, yeah, well, more or less something like that. Okay, so another aspect which is important here is the arbitrariness, if that's even a word, of setting of actors of the story of history, or the conflict even in the first place. Because, well, as you probably might notice, if you say something about the past, let's say, if you tell some story about the past, no, spirit from the past is going to appear and like slap you in the face because you told a lie about the past and it's not how it happened really, right? So to a large degree, what you're talking about when you're talking about the past is completely arbitrary, and that will be a little bit important a little bit later. But what's important here is that there's no criterion for truth in history, and that's a big problem, or at least, well, it should be recognized. I mean, we might just accept that as a given, that there's no criterion of truth. And I would say that the same is true, again, if you've watched my videos on science, you would probably know that, or at least know that I think that, right? The same is true even in natural sciences, that natural sciences also have no, strictly speaking, no criterion for truth. And like the best we can do so far, this post-positivistic philosophy, which is kind of okay, but still it doesn't really grasp the very nature of things, let's say. So anyway, the best we can do so far is have this weak criterion of falsifiability. Weak, I mean, that's my statement, that it is weak. It's not like it's called weak criterion. No, it's called just criterion of falsifiability. But I'm saying it's weak, right? And why do I do that? Well, for a lot of reasons. Because, well, for example, as it has been shown, even if you falsify a theory, like a theory might be saved by introduction of additional hypotheses. Like you falsify Newtonian gravitation by observing the rotation of galaxies, no problem. We introduce hypothesis of dark matter. Newtonian gravitation is saved. So there you go. Falsifiability doesn't really work. But anyway, there's another thing I wanted to note, well, yeah, so basically in history we don't even have this weak criterion of falsifiability, so in natural sciences, let's say, we have those political ensembles basically just cross-referencing each other and forming these long networks. That's what we consider more true than, let's say, other theory. If a theory has very long political networks in scientific world, it means that it's more true than the theory that has shorter networks, right? So this is the only way we are able of dealing with the truth in science. But in history, again, we don't even have the falsifiability thing, right? And even more so, like in natural sciences, you might fool yourself and say, well, at least we can make predictions, right? Okay, yes, you can make predictions. And you might say, well, at least we can experiment on things. And yes, you can. And you might say, well, yeah, well, pretty much that's enough, I would say. But in history, you don't have falsifiability, you don't have experiments, you don't have predictions, and even more so, yeah, that's another thing I missed. You're working with unique phenomena, right, that happened only once, which means that, well, history is not science. That's the most basic and obvious conclusion from that. Again, remember what I've said about medicine, that medicine is not science, because it works with unique phenomena. A human being is a unique phenomenon, right? It's only scientific as it applies to many human beings simultaneously, like, and kind of, sort of, right? So many human beings would be like repeating cases of a human being, something like that. But in case of history, it's obvious that it's not scientific. Like, it's just, there's no way you can fit history into the definition of science. It's just, well, you might say, well, it has some properties of science, like it accumulates some statements, let's say, but that's the library, part of it. Library is not really a science, it's just a collection of things. So yeah, I'll return to that issue later, probably somewhere in the conclusions. But so far, to the issue of history not being a science. Right. So, speaking about political aspects, what's good about history in certain sense is that the political networks are more visible because of all that I've just said, that, you don't have this, or at least to that degree as in natural sciences. You don't have this self-deception that we're dealing with some kind of truth here. You know, well, some historians are sort of self-deceiving themselves and saying, well, we're kind of dealing with the truth, right? But if you're, well, probably it's because historians are also not very good at philosophy. So they would claim that, yeah, we're talking about truth, but a decent historian, well-educated historian would pretty quickly figure out that no, it's not about the truth at all. And so it makes the political networks in history much more visible and like vivid, right? So it makes the corporate character of scientific communities, like communities of historians, much more obvious. Like a certain community utilizes a certain array, certain pantheon of terms and concepts. The other community utilizes completely different one, and they all try to describe history in their own way, right? Something like that. So it all becomes obvious. As well, what is obvious in the case of history is the cases of the literal rewriting of history, you know, by the governments, etc., or by some non-governmental organizations. Again, Jesuits, which I've mentioned a lot, like we're utilizing their version of history more or less to this day. I mean, everything before 17th century, let's say, is written by the Jesuits. So that's a clear corporate interest, and that's a clear rewriting. Even the Soviets didn't rewrite Jesuit version of history that much. They did, but they just kind of switched the terms. But they didn't really doubt the general narrative, something to that effect. Okay, so what was I talking about? Yeah, so the cases of rewriting of history justifiably raise suspicions, you know. And you might say, well, in natural sciences you have something to that effect, like you have the scientific revolutions, so-called, where something like rewriting also occurs, and like, well, again, take the case of Copernicus, for example. So again, see my video about 7 lessons from Copernican revolution. Again, one of the first videos on this channel. So before Copernicus even, like, let's just assume that he existed, and the Jesuit version of it is more or less true, and like our current version of what happened is true. So until Copernicus got all the political support he got, like especially in the late 17th century and like the first half of 18th century, he was no one, like nobody really knew about him, and he wasn't very impactful at all, right? So he wasn't even present in the narrative, you know, in the scientific or historical narrative. Whereas afterwards, when he already got these long political networks, I mean, he was already dead, but the whole idea, he became like a martyr for the cause, like a very intelligent human being, and like the guy who like was at the very edge, you know, something like that. So that's a clear rewriting of history, right? So it's not being the case at the moment, like nobody really knows about him, nobody really cares about him, but like 100 years later, he becomes like a pillar of science, you know, like a giant, etc. So that's a clear rewriting of history. But in terms of science, at least, it's a scientific revolution again. So, yeah, well, it's a good example, I would say, of the same thing. And in science, you also have this thing which is called correspondence principle. I think it was introduced by Bohr, which means that well, it gives you the illusion of inheritance. So what it says is basically the new theory should include the old theory as a particular case, as a special case in some phase space, in some area of, well, let's say at some parameters, right? So you have a larger new theory to which the old theory is included as a special case. So this is correspondence principle. And it gives you an illusion of this, how do you say it, inheritance of the new theory and the old theory between them, rather. But okay. But it's not always present, again, in stories of history. Like, sometimes history just gets completely rewritten. Like again, I think you might think about some examples, and it's not really hard, frankly. So, especially in the modern situation, political situation. So, the conflict or political nature of historical narratives, of historical knowledge, is really obvious. That's basically the whole point of this super long rant. So, you know, who controls the past controls the future, right? So, and the now testify! No. So, and multiple machinations are obvious here. Again, not only the rewriting of history, but just telling convenient stories about your past. And it's actually viable even for a human being. Like, you construct your past in the way that's, like, in the way that it is narratively efficient. Like, you can tell the story about you in some terms, right? In some easy terms. And you can, again, insert some conflict into it, etc. And like, show how you, like, heroically overcome all your issues, etc., all the enemies, so to speak. But it's also true for governments, for the whole countries and nations, etc., like, to tell convenient stories about your past, to win political points through constructing the past that's, you know, good for you in the present, let's say. And in this case, any sort of conspirology or alternative history, as if there was unalternative history somewhere, somehow. So anything like that would do to win political points. Okay, and let's return to this issue of the role of conflict again. So this, I would say that this category of contradiction, of negation, if you like, it appeared, at least to the scale that we know it for, in roughly like 16th to 17th centuries, or about so. And I would claim, that's a pretty strong claim, but I'm able, at least I'm ready to defend it, that it's also the time of appearance of history, the very same time, like 16th to 17th century, pretty much. And it was the time of appearance of this category, this mental or philosophical idea of contradiction and negation, something like that. And in this regard, again, I would repeat my point from Repentive Thinking video, that historical event is really just like a revolution in miniature, you know, where so the state of things got revolved, you know, got turned from the state X to state Y, etc., etc. And the Reformation and the start of modernity, which again all happened in the given time frame, 16th to 17th century, negation was really important for those things, for those thought processes, or whatever, how would you call it? So the things like modernization appeared, which is basically negation of the past, right? We need to be modern from that moment, so we kind of push the past away, so we kind of introduce this break, again, about which I've talked about in my repetitive thinking video. And the appearance of printing press also did help a lot, because it allowed you to spread propaganda pretty easily, pretty quickly. And plus, the appearance of national states in, let's say, 18th and 19th centuries helped a lot, because and since then, I would say history, helped in terms of appearance of history. And since then, since the appearance of national states, history was really prospering. And it's no wonder, because again, as I've said, it's very political internally. So since then, roughly 19th century, let's say, history and politics have so much in common. They have such close ties, that the history today is almost exclusively thought about as something about the state, and it's really ridiculous, I would say. But anyway, we really think, at least if you think about how you think about things, you would see that if there is no state, there's no national states, nothing happens, There's nothing that's going on. And of course, it produces certain artifacts. This tying to the national state in 19th century, of history. It produces certain artifacts, such as, the state of ancient Egypt, for example, like the government of ancient Egypt, which was obviously formed by the nation called ancient Egyptians, right? Because, well, what else can it be, right? Or the state of ancient Greece, which was obviously formed by the nation called the ancient Greeks. Or Carthage, obviously created by Carthaginians, etc., etc. So it's rubbish on so many levels that I don't even know where to start, So again, the concept of national state appeared in the end of the 18th century, so the concept of nation appeared in the end of the 18th century. So what kind of nation of Egyptians you can talk about? You can talk about some societies, let's say, here and there. In Greece, you might talk about policies, right? And maybe alliances of policies, but there was no such nation as ancient Greece. It wasn't even a thing, But okay. So we talked about those stupid artifacts of our more modern way of thinking about state and history. And another illusion that we have because of that is the attribution of land, let's say, to a certain state. Again, we look at the map and we say that the ancient Egypt was here, and we fill it with some color. Whereas this is rubbish. The relationships between people and land, and the way people owned land, etc., was all so different back then. If you think about feudal age, it was so complicated. A certain king might have had vassals who had their own vassals, etc., and then the peasant might have had a certain amount of land, and it wasn't the land of the king. The peasant has had his sovereign in the face of some other feudal, etc. It was a network. It wasn't a solid thing that you can just fill with a color, But okay, I'm digressing, I'm sorry. But yeah, attribution of land is really ridiculous in this case. It really is a product of modernity, the attribution of land to a certain state. In fact, I can even give you a date where it appeared. It's 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, where Europe and the world at large was divided between nations, more or less, even though national states didn't even exist back then. Again, as I've said, it took more than a century for them to appear afterwards. But okay, so this crooked approach of the connection between history and state actually brings up very interesting artifacts of cultural sort even. And here I wish to talk a little bit about the end of history of Fukuyama, you know, this book of Francis Fukuyama called End of History. So there, roughly speaking, what he says, and it's more like my interpretation, so I'm not really claiming that I'm just repeating his words, because most of them are actually rubbish. So I'm just pretty much giving you my interpretation of what he says, whereas he might not even agree with what I would say. So what he says, I claim he says, or what he should have said, let's put it that way, is that capitalism doesn't need national states, and liberalism actually clearly contradicts, for example, democracy, democratic state. And again, I've had a video about this, liberalism versus democracy, or vice versa, democracy versus liberalism. So, since capitalism doesn't need a state, and liberalism, and I mean in the classical sense, I don't mean it in American sense. So liberalism contradicts democracy directly, and capitalism doesn't need national state. So since we have the largest state in history, which is the USSR, being destroyed at the beginning of the 1990s, and the largest conflict, or at least like sort of the Cold War. I mean, some people actually consider Cold War as the Third World War, and I think it's more or less justified in many respects. But anyway, so the largest conflict ended, the largest state fell down. So what Fukuyama says is that, well, we're at the end of history. Like, that's it pretty much, guys, you know. History was about national states, and now look at that. National states, I mean states in general, crumble, and the conflict between them ends. So what are we going to do next? Nothing's going to happen, right? Because everything happens only if you have national state. History is about national state. So since, well, not exactly national, like any kind of state really, but so yeah, we're at the end of history. That was the point of Fukuyama, because for something to happen, you need a state. But there's interesting kind of offshoot of this idea, which I wish to emphasize, is that, well, think about it. Just think about this particular connection that he makes, or rather he should have made, between the national state, or in general state, the government, let's say, and conflict. That's a very important thing that he notes, right? That if we get rid of governments, we get rid of conflicts, right? So there would be nothing to propel history as we know it, because there would be no conflict. So, and now think about it, about the particular types of conflicts we have, about wars, for example. So essentially, effectively, what Fukuyama says, and he is correct, I believe, is that if you eliminate the government and the state, you wouldn't have wars anymore. Okay? So, go figure. It's a pretty solid statement, I would say, and I completely agree with it. Well, because it's my statement, really. And people would just peacefully cooperate instead of waging war on each other. And I've had this sort of argument with one person once. So we were talking about anarcho-capitalism, and so he was asking me, like, what the hell? Like, if we abolish the government, like, what's going to happen to politics? The politics would disappear, right? And like, as if it was a bad thing. And I said, well, probably, yeah, because, well, what is politics, essentially? It's the struggle for being in control of this Leviathan, let's say, right? Which robs and enslaves people. And then as you get into the control of this machine, you can wage war on other Leviathans, and that's more or less what we consider history, right? I mean, returning to the point of Fukuyama. So, yeah, we wouldn't have politics because, I mean, if you dissolve the machine of enslavement and robbery, which is the government, well, you probably also dissolve the struggle for control of this machine, right? It's clearly obvious, but is that a bad thing? Like, do you want to be controlled? Do you want to be robbed? Do you want to be enslaved? Do you want politics? You know, because politics is about that. It's about the control over government, which enslaves you and robs you and sends you to war. That's what it does, and makes you poor. I don't think it's a bad thing if we get rid of all that. But okay, here I wish to like make a short comment, and I'm really seeing that this video is going to be like 90 minutes long after all, but damn. But we'll see. So a short like statement, a couple of statements is that today, in like in recent years, we really observe some like new statism, you know, the rise of this, how do you say it? Damn, there's a word, sentiment, let's say, of statism. Like we have trade wars, protectionism, like invasion of Hong Kong, and potential enslavement by China. But I would say that it's the fifth wave, if you like, speaking in Eliot's wave theory terms. So it's like a rise between, like a final rise between the complete fall, or at least a strong motion in the other direction. So, or at least I would hope so, because, well, who knows what's gonna happen next. But I would say that in general, the modern level of technology and the culture, the development of society doesn't need states anymore. I don't mean the United States or Mexican states or Indian states. I mean national states, the way they are present today. They're not needed. They're obsolete. They're hindering progress. So hopefully this rise of nationalism that we observed recently would mean just like the last attempt to save it before it would crumble completely. So I would say that national states are probably already dead. They just don't know it, you know. Although there are also tendencies to establish a supranational state, you know, some world government of sorts, and especially it's obvious when you look at the modern ecological movement, you know, global warming and things like that. Like, it's clear that the whole point is to establish the world socialistic government. It's like, it's not even a conspiracy. It's just almost stated outright what they're doing, right? With all these rubbish theories. And this almost like a religion of ecologism, you know, this Gaia, the cult of Gaia, which is like the earth, the mother earth, etc., which we pollute and kill, etc., etc. All this stupid, idiotic thing. Again, see my video, Repentive Thinking, to know where it all comes from, aside from, you know, some lobbyists. Okay, so let's return to our discussion of history. So the modernity, which was established in like 17th century, roughly speaking, it breaks up with the past, right? But at the same time, what's interesting is that it produces like its own evil genius, so to speak, traditionalism, because modernity creates the past, and at the same, I mean, it creates the present, the modern, but at the same time it creates the past, the tradition, because tradition doesn't really exist in the past. I mean, when you were in the past before modernity, you didn't even know what tradition is, because you were embedded into the tradition, right? So to you, it wasn't a tradition, it was just the way the world works, right? So you didn't even have this concept. But when we kind of put this mark, would say, well, we're modern, they're old, they're the tradition. That's where tradition really appears. And that was 17th century, roughly speaking. Like from 17th to early 19th century, I should say. And think about all those European companies which are proud of their history and their heritage, etc. Or think about, again, heraldry, genealogies, all these bankers' families, you know, those kinds of things. That's what I mean. Last names appear more or less in 17th century, about so. Like in some places which were less populated, they didn't even appear at all. Like in Iceland, for example, they don't have last names even to this day because, well, they don't even have 400,000 people, so they don't really need it. Like a lot of serfs didn't have last names, or maybe even all of them, like in Russia until 1861. Actually, probably the majority of population didn't have last names. But anyway, so more or less they appear in 17th century. That's my point. So modernity created all those things, you know. And at the same time, what occurs is finding like mysterious, sudden appearance of ancient texts, you know, if you know what I mean, like Nibelungen of Germans, or this tale of the Igor's, how do you translate it? Whatever. So a lot of texts supposedly of ancient origins appear in that time. And it's not a big miracle, because again, the concept of nation appears with the French Revolution, whereas previously you were just subjects of a monarch, of a king. Now you are, you know, citoyens, like citizens. You are French. You're not just a vassal or a serf. You are a citizen now. So it's a very late invention. It's the end of the 18th century, like 1790 something, roughly. And again, in 1806, the Roman Empire was dissolved, thanks to Napoleon, which also allowed a lot of nations to arise, like, for example, Germans, which appear in the middle of 19th century, or Russians, which also appear in the middle of 19th century, more or less, or Italians, which appear in the middle of the 19th century, etc. So, yeah, it was the age of nationalism. Like, as Massimo d'Azeglio, the Italian politician, well, afterwards Italian, before that he wasn't Italian, in 1866 he literally said, we have made Italy, now we have to make Italians. 1866, think about it. So, and the way they did that, created Germans, Russians, Italians, the French, is through, first of all, language unification. So in Italy, for example, they took the Florentine dialect, the Florence dialect, and kind of built their language around it. Because before that, there wasn't really an Italian language. There was no such thing. There were kind of localized dialects of something, which was derived from Latin, obviously. And the same did happen with France, although a little bit earlier, again, as I've said, they kind of precede all the other nations by like half a century. And in Russia, the same thing happened. And in Germany, the same thing happened, where, like, for example, the grammar of German language was only, how do you say it, produced, let's say, in 1850s by Brothers Grimm. So, yeah, there you go. The very, very same story. Okay, there was some other thing I wanted to mention, but I kind of forgot, but let's forget about it. It's already almost an hour-long video. Damn. Let's go. So, this contradiction between past and present introduced by modernity, I would say it's a part of general binary character of modernity. And again, when people say about genders, like non-gender binary, again, it's kind of the product of modernity, this binary character. Not only genders, it's about, I mean, perception. I mean, I don't really mean that genders appeared. I mean the concept of gender as such. Well, okay, I have a video about gender, so go and watch it if you like. So Michel Foucault, in his book Les mots et les choses, in chapter 2, section 5, He also notes that this previous, as he calls it, tertiary character of interpretation of symbolic representation systems was exchanged for substituted by binary, right? We have tertiary and we substituted with binary in roughly 16th century. And yeah, so it impacted the whole culture pretty much. Modernity really, it's everywhere you look. So, and you might say that nations in general appear through like contradiction with other nations. But again, you might ask, well, what about this idea of contradictions in like Roman and Greek times? Again, Heraclitus, etc., or Chinese or Indian philosophy, etc. Well, here I would say that again, I have serious doubts about dating of all those texts. Again, if you look at Buddhist texts, they all appear in like 19th century. Well, like not all of them, but most important ones, and they come from Britain of all places. Max Müller, etc. But okay. And plus, it was a different scale in modernity. You know, all these things. I mean, negation, contradiction. They didn't have that much of an impact on an ancient civilization, at least the way we understand it right now. Okay, so it's really an invention of modernity. So it made the negation or contradiction the key element of culture. Almost like a horse that drags everything, the religion, the art, the science. Like one interesting example I might give you is the equation in mathematics, because equations only appeared in the late 17th century, believe it or not. So you again, that's the start of modernity. That's the Maunder minimum, if you know what I mean. The solar activity. So the contradiction, the equation is fundamentally like the contradiction between left and right parts, you know. So it's kind of the same idea of equality, you know. Again, equality in society, like human rights, liberalism, John Locke. It's all, again, the second half of 17th century. It's the same time period, etc., etc. So yeah, well, okay. I feel I'm digressing really strongly from the topic, but one last thing before I go to the conclusions would be to talk a little bit about framing and in history, in stories of history. And what do I mean by framing is the focusing of vision, if you like, to get the distance and time and all the decorations correctly, to be able to tell your story, fundamentally. So in this case, again, history goes in the same watercourse as drama, and it kind of kicks out all the unimportant things and only retains the important things. So there's an ethical aspect in it, you know. Ethics is all about our values, what we value, what we deem important. So there's also this aspect about history, and it's also therefore, it's another argument in the favor of idea that history is not science, because it has this ethical aspect too, right? Because we need to set the context. We need to know what's important and what is not. We need to frame our history. I mean our story of history. Like, let's say if you need to see, like, perceive the assassination, you have to be, in terms of the story, you need to sort of like be close to the victim and the murderer, both in time and space. You know, you have to choose the proper scale to tell your story. Or if you want to perceive the battle, well, then you certainly would have to utilize a much larger scale. You would have to set the distance larger. You would have to set the time larger, definitely. Like speed it up like 100 times at least, or maybe 1,000 times, so that, you know, you would have like an hour per second, let's say, and so that you wouldn't even be able to see separate people. What you would see is only like regiments and armies, right? So that would be a proper framing for battle. Or if you're like trying to tell a story about a country, you have to at all move to some abstract and symbolic level, abstract and symbolic language, because, well, if you're talking about a country, it's a very abstract notion. There's no such thing as country in the physical world, It exists in behaviors of people, in their imagination, in their value systems, etc. Like, let's say, economy, judiciary system, or whatever, how you call it, military, education. Those are all abstract concepts, right? They don't exist in the physical world. So you need to use abstract language to think about all of that. So, and plus you need to, again, speed the time up like 1,000,000 times perhaps, so that, 1 month would be 1 second in your time. So yeah, so basically my point is that the framing of the story is important in history, because otherwise you wouldn't even perceive the story in the first place. And you might say that it's the role of listener, right? In the terms that I've proposed previously in my video about the nature of knowledge, where I said that the listener is really the set of restrictions that we put on our story. And that is in this case, it's the frame. Or at least it's a part of all the restrictions that are placed. Okay, so let's conclude this. So a few points that I want to make is that the first point is that, again, to kind of just sum up what I was talking about, the first point, oh yeah, damn, I remembered what I wanted to talk about before that. In one of the segments when I talk about how national states appear, I wanted to talk about the Romantic era, the first half of 19th century, which was the time when all these things appeared, like the nationalistic myths. They all pretty much come from this first half of the 19th century. And I wanted to tell you a historical anecdote, the folklore, all of those things, all of them were recorded in the first half of 19th century. So there was one funny story about this, which is about Prosper Mérimée, the French novelist, romantic who published a book, La Guzla, which is like a Slavic musical instrument, in 1827. So what he confessed later in the second edition, which was in like 1840, I think, was that, so he literally says that, okay, me and my friend, we wanted to go to Balkans to study some, local culture and like gather some folklore, etc. So that was exactly the Romantic era, right? 1820s. But, he says, we didn't have enough money, so we couldn't go there. So what we decided to do, or at least Mérimée decided to do, is to actually write a completely like out of the blue type of folklore, just himself, just made it up, write a book, publish it, get some money, and use the money he would get for this book to go to Balkans. Like, just think about it. And I'm absolutely convinced that a good portion of all the folklore that we think about or can think about is created more or less in the same manner. So it's all like mythology. Again, as I've said, modernity created the present, but it also created the past. And again, Romantic era shows pretty well how it was done, which is like with absolute disregard to the truth, or whatever we consider the truth today, right? So, but anyway, I hope it was at least a little bit amusing for you, this anecdote. But it shows pretty well, I think, what was going on back then. But all right, so let's go to the conclusions finally. So the first point I want to make is that the stories of history are pretty much the same as dramatic stories. So history is very similar to drama in general. And the same logic is acting there, and same temporal organization. Again, those 5 elements that I've listed, the pre-state X, which is like the context, the background, all the unknowns, all the free wills that would act later. Then the state X, then the again, pre-state X is like a prologue, state X is like the setup, or the exposition, or whatever. Historical event is the third element, which is the climax in dramatic terms. Then we have the fourth element, which is the state Y, which is the, how did I call it, conclusion, or outcome in dramatic terms. And the post-state Y is the epilogue, right? So we have those very similar elements in the story of history and drama. Okay, second point is that the historical event is really a small revolution in its own right, and kind of it turns things around from the state X into state Y. And again, revolution literally means to turn over, right? When things kind of stand on their heads afterwards or something like that. And the cultural roots of both the revolution and historical event lie in Christian repentativeness and the event of baptism. But again, I've talked about that in my repentive thinking video, so please watch it if you're interested. The third point is that the key role of conflict in history is observed, just as in drama, because otherwise there would be no motion. The conflict, again, as I've said, like the machine of history, of the story of history, is deterministic, but it needs some fuel, which is the conflict. Conflict is the fuel for the story, even though it's all deterministic and machine-like, right? Okay, the fourth point is that history is filled with political, pretty much just like any other sciences, but here it's even more obvious, right, in case of history, because history is not science, as I've said, and there are many points in favor of that, like it works with unique phenomena, which is not scientific. It's not falsifiable, which is not scientific, even though sciences are also not falsifiable, but even more so, let's say. Then what else? What other arguments did I have? It has the ethical component, ethical aspect, like we need to distinguish the important and unimportant things. And yeah, well, I kind of forgot what I was talking about previously, but there was some other point, all right? So yeah, history is not science, basically, that's my point. But what it is, you might ask, because I've said that medicine is not science, but I also said that it's a branch of engineering. Well, what is history then? Well, it's not science, it's not engineering, it's not philosophy. I would say that history is an art, actually. And in particular, it's an art of reconstruction, a storytelling, basically. So imagine you have somebody gives you a play, like a text, where you know the ending really well, but like throughout the text, it almost absent. You only have some isolated phrases here and there and descriptions here and there. So your task is to complete this text, like fill all the gaps so that everything would fit together. So that's what historians do ultimately. And this is art, because it's clear that you have infinitely many ways of filling those gaps. And really, yeah, so there's no historical truth. It's just impossible. And again, history is an art. It's an art of reconstruction. It's not science. It's not philosophy. Not at all. All right. So the fifth point I wanted to make to conclude this longest rant so far, I guess, is that history appears in modernity, that is 17th century, roughly speaking, and even more so in 19th century. And by the way, Jesuit history was also written in 16th century, 16th or 17th century. So yeah, it clearly fits. And it's neatly tied to national states, or at least this sort of thinking about those states as units of being, so to speak, on the world map, and their relationships between each other. So that's why history is so focused on military issues, diplomatic, administrative issues, etc. And plus, that's why it's so obsessed with abstract constructs, you know, things like nation, the thing that doesn't exist anywhere except your imagination, nation, you know. And other conditional things is also something that history is obsessed with. Things like attribution of land to a certain nation, whereas, well, what the hell? Land is just land. Like, it doesn't have any relation to you, relation to nation, you know. Or citizenship, like if you read about some guy in 16th century and they say like, oh, he was an Italian thinker. What the hell? Like, Italians didn't even exist back then. So why do you claim this citizenship? Like, he was a subject of some king or whatever, or an emperor of Roman Empire or whatever. Like, that's ridiculous. But anyway, the sixth point is that the framing that I've talked about at the very end is important for the stories of history. And by framing, I mean the proper focusing of your perspective. Because, well, just like in any other field, like in natural sciences, you might think about experiment. Like, any experiment needs to be framed. You need to focus on particular phenomenon, like frame it properly, like, again, eliminate all the other factors, etc., etc. So you also need framing in sciences, but in history also. So that historical event might be perceived. Well, a classical move, you might say, in stories of history is to, like, at the very end, shift the perspective and show this, what I've called post-state Y, this epilogue, the connection of this whole thing we were talking about, of this historical event, to the rest of the stories of history, like the whole reservoir of stories, right? Like what impact did the assassination of Kennedy had on American politics, on world politics, etc. That's the kind of thing you talk about in the epilogue, right? Whereas the assassination itself, it's very vivid and like small scale, you know. It's something that happens on the street, literally on an isolated street, etc. Okay. Yeah, probably we should finish summary here, but to finish it all, I wish to add a thing that wasn't present in the essay on which this video is based. So this is sort of like a postscriptum, PS, is that I've had a thought recently, like a couple of months ago, that history only sees in the past what it considers important in the present, right? Again, this ethical component that I was talking about. So this framing and drama, etc., etc. But anyway, it can only discern in the past what it considers important in the present. So therefore, I would claim that it cannot notice what would be important in the future. It just doesn't know that, right? And therefore, even more importantly, perhaps, we don't know what to take into account when we're talking about future. History is not at all going to help us here. I mean, in trying to discern what's important. And I would claim that, you know, the important people of the future, all the future leaders in culture and science and religion and whatever, are already among us. Like right now, metaphorically speaking, the foundation is already there, but it's just that we don't see it yet. We don't see the building yet because it's not built yet, but the foundation is already there, right? So you cannot condense it, so to speak, to focus on it, to grasp it. It's somewhere there. Those people are among us. They're on the streets of New York and Paris and in some village in China, etc. But we don't notice them because we cannot catch them, you know. We don't know them yet, so to speak. Yeah. We cannot tell the story about them yet. So I would say that I would call it maybe like John Connor effect, you know, or something like that. Like this regular boy who like is just a regular boy, but the guy from the future already knows that it's not just a regular boy, you know. And even though like all the people don't even notice him because he's just a regular boy, like the guy from the future knows who he is or who he is gonna become, etc. So it's the same thing that I'm talking about. So who knows, maybe one of those people who's gonna shape the future, well, arguably we're all gonna shape the future to that degree or another, but you know, to a larger degree than the others. Maybe one of those people, maybe it is you, or maybe it's someone you know. And I think that that's the good way to finish this video. So, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.